The call came at midnight. Urgent business that couldn't wait. The voice belonged to Marco Bellini, his consigliere, his most trusted advisor for 15 years. Marco had never steered him wrong. Vittorio Caruso drove himself to the abandoned warehouse on Pier 47. No bodyguards tonight. Marco insisted this meeting stay quiet. Something about loyalty. Vittorio trusted that circle with his life. Big mistake. The warehouse was dark except for a single light hanging in the center. 3 men waited in the shadows. Marco Bellini stood to the left. Sal Russo, his enforcer, blocked the exit. And Luca De Luca, his own blood cousin, stepped into the light with a gun drawn. "Vittorio," Marco said calmly. "We're done following your rules." The first bullet hit his chest before he could respond. Then another. And another. 7 shots total, each one fired by the men he'd trusted most. Vittorio collapsed to the concrete floor, blood pooling beneath him. His vision blurred as he watched them walk away without looking back. Marco Bellini had been planning this for months. He was tired of being second in command, tired of taking orders from a man who'd grown too soft, too careful. Vittorio's rules about protecting civilians, about avoiding unnecessary violence, about keeping the business clean, those rules were killing their profits. Sal Russo agreed. The enforcer wanted more territory, more freedom to handle problems his own way. Under Vittorio's leadership, there were too many restrictions, too many people who couldn't be touched. Sal was built for violence, and Vittorio kept him on a leash. But Luca De Luca was the real surprise. Family wasn't supposed to betray family. That was the oldest rule in their world. Yet Luca had his reasons. Vittorio had promised him control of the dockyard operations 3 years ago, but that promotion never came. Resentment grew like poison in Luca's chest until Marco offered him something better, a full third of Vittorio's empire. By sunrise, the 3 men had divided the territories. Marco took control of downtown and the political connections. Sal claimed the east side and all enforcement operations. Luca got the docks and shipping routes. They told the other families that Vittorio had disappeared, probably dead, definitely not coming back. The city belonged to them now. Dr. Marcus Chen wasn't supposed to be working that night. He'd retired from surgery 5 years earlier. Now he ran a small clinic in the warehouse district, treating people who couldn't afford hospitals. Someone pounded on his door at 2 in the morning. Antonio Rivera, one of Vittorio's oldest soldiers, dragged in a body covered in blood. A man so broken and bullet-riddled that Dr. Chen almost refused to help. But then he recognized the face. Vittorio Caruso. The man who'd once helped Dr. Chen's daughter when she got in trouble. The man who'd quietly paid for his wife's cancer treatments when insurance refused. Dr. Chen worked through the night. 7 bullet wounds. 2 collapsed lungs. Massive internal bleeding. He removed 6 bullets, but 1 was too close to the heart to extract. That 7th bullet would stay inside Vittorio forever. Vittorio survived, but barely. His face was scarred, his body broken. When he finally opened his eyes 3 days later, he looked nothing like the powerful boss who'd ruled the city. He looked like a ghost. Vittorio spent 2 weeks recovering in Dr. Chen's basement. During those painful days, he watched news coverage of his city falling apart. Gang violence escalating. Territories being fought over. Innocent people caught in crossfire. His rules had kept order for 20 years. No drugs near schools. No civilian casualties. No unnecessary brutality. Disputes were settled through negotiation. The families respected those rules because Vittorio enforced them. Now those rules meant nothing. Marco, Sal, and Luca were tearing down everything he'd built. They fought each other over territory. They executed rivals publicly. They put fear into the streets instead of stability. The worst part was hearing his own name. Reporters called him a ghost from the past. His former associates spoke like he'd never existed. Marco gave interviews claiming Vittorio had grown weak. Antonio brought newspapers each morning. Vittorio read every article, memorized every detail. He watched his empire burn from the shadows. His body healed slowly, but his rage grew faster. These men had shot him 7 times and stolen everything he'd built. They thought he was dead. That was their first mistake. Vittorio's mind drifted back while his body healed. He remembered the moment he'd spared each of them, the moments when mercy had been his biggest weakness. Marco Bellini had stolen from the organization 8 years ago. Not much, just enough to cover gambling debts. Vittorio discovered the theft during a routine audit. The punishment for stealing was death. Everyone knew that rule. But Marco had served loyally for 7 years before that mistake. He had a wife, 3 children. Vittorio decided mercy was worth the risk. He forgave Marco, gave him a second chance, and promoted him to consigliere 3 years later. Sal Russo had killed a civilian during a collection. The man was just defending his shop, and Sal had beaten him to death in front of witnesses. Vittorio should have eliminated Sal immediately. But Sal's father had been a loyal soldier who died protecting Vittorio during a territory war. Out of respect for that sacrifice, Vittorio spared the son. He gave Sal another chance, promoted him to lead enforcer, trusted him with the organization's security. Luca de Luca was family. Blood. When Luca got addicted to cocaine and started missing shipments, losing money, creating problems, family code demanded consequences. But Vittorio couldn't kill his own cousin. Instead, he paid for rehab, gave Luca clean work at the docks, tried to help him rebuild his life. Mercy had created monsters. Marco Bellini ruled through fear instead of respect. Within 3 weeks of taking control, he'd executed 6 people who questioned his authority. He raised protection fees by 40%. He expanded into territories that Vittorio had kept neutral. Hospitals, schools, churches. Nothing was sacred anymore. The other families watched nervously. Vittorio's leadership had brought stability. Marco's reign brought chaos. But no one dared challenge him. Marco had Sal's enforcement crew and Luca's dock operations. He controlled the weapons, money, and muscle. Downtown businesses that used to operate smoothly now lived in constant fear. Shop owners faced arbitrary demands for more money. Marco's collectors were brutal. They didn't negotiate. They just took what they wanted and hurt anyone who resisted. The police couldn't control the violence. Politicians pretended they'd never known Vittorio. The city had been better when the mob operated with rules. Now those rules were gone and everyone suffered. Antonio brought Vittorio reports every night. Each story made his blood run hotter. But his body was still weak. Rushing back would get him killed. He needed patience. He needed to become something unexpected. 1 month after the betrayal, Vittorio could finally stand without help. His chest ached with every breath. His left arm would never fully straighten again. Scars covered his torso like a roadmap of survival. But he was alive. And alive meant he could plan revenge. Dr. Chen tried to convince him to leave the city. "You have enough money hidden away," the doctor said. "Start somewhere new. Forget about them." But Vittorio couldn't forget. He'd built his empire with honor. He'd created rules that protected the innocent. He'd shown mercy to men who didn't deserve it. Those men had repaid his mercy with betrayal and bullets. Late one night, alone in the basement clinic, Vittorio made a blood oath. He cut his palm with a knife and let the blood drip onto the concrete floor. "I swear on my life," he whispered to the empty room, "they will not die quickly. They will lose everything first. Their power, their money, their loyalty, their sanity. Only then, when they have nothing left, will they understand what they stole from me." Death was too easy. Any street thug could pull a trigger. Vittorio wanted something deeper. He wanted them to feel every day what he'd felt lying on that warehouse floor bleeding out. He wanted them to watch their empire crumble the way they'd made him watch his burn. Revenge wasn't about killing. It was about lasting ruin. Vittorio Caruso died that night. Not physically but in every other way. The man who wore expensive suits and commanded respect, that man was gone forever. Someone different stood in his place. Someone harder. Someone invisible. He cut his hair short and dyed it gray. He grew a beard that hid his facial scars. He wore cheap clothes from thrift stores. He looked like any struggling middle-aged man, the kind powerful mobsters would never notice. Antonio wanted to spread word that Vittorio survived, to rally soldiers and start a war. But Vittorio refused. War required armies and armies required trust. Trust had earned him 7 bullets. "No one can know I'm alive," Vittorio told Antonio. "Not yet. Let them think they won. Let them feel safe. Let them make mistakes." Dr. Chen provided fake identification. Vittorio became Victor Cross, a name with no history. He moved into a small apartment in the warehouse district where no one asked questions. For the first time in 20 years, Vittorio walked the streets without bodyguards, without respect, without fear from others. He was invisible, a ghost. His enemies had tried to erase him. Now he'd use that erasure against them. Antonio Rivera remembered what loyalty meant. 20 years ago, he'd been left bleeding in an alley after a territory dispute went wrong. His own crew had abandoned him to save themselves. Everyone assumed he was dead. Vittorio found him that night. He carried Antonio to safety, paid for his medical care, and gave him a place in the organization when others thought he was worthless. Antonio never forgot that. While everyone else believed Vittorio was dead, Antonio searched for 3 days until he found him bleeding out near the pier. Now, 6 weeks after the betrayal, Antonio was the only soldier Vittorio fully trusted. They met in secret every few days, always in different locations. Antonio brought information about how the territories were operating, who was loyal to Marco, who was unhappy with the new leadership. "Half the organization wants the old rules back," Antonio reported during one meeting. "Marco's collectors are too violent. They're making enemies everywhere. Shop owners are talking to police. Families are nervous about the attention." Vittorio listened carefully. He'd built his empire on understanding people. What motivated them, what scared them, what they'd sacrifice for. Marco ruled through fear, but fear was unstable. Cracked under pressure. It turned allies into enemies when they felt they had nothing left to lose. "We're not starting a war," Vittorio told Antonio. "We're going to make them destroy themselves." Vittorio spent his days studying. He watched Marco's operation from coffee shops and street corners. He listened to conversations in bars where soldiers complained. He tracked money movements through connections that still owed him favors. The new empire had cracks. Marco, Sal, and Luca had divided territories but hadn't agreed on sharing profits from joint operations. Marco wanted larger cuts because he handled political connections. Sal demanded more because his enforcers did dangerous work. Luca argued the docks generated the most reliable income. Greed was predictable. Vittorio had warned them about it for years. When partners fought over money, organizations collapsed. He just needed to make those cracks wider. He learned who owed money, which captains were stretched thin, which operations barely profited, which soldiers were unhappy. Every organization had weak points. Antonio provided insider details. He was still technically part of the organization, pretending to accept the new leadership. No one suspected him. Patience was harder than violence. But Vittorio had learned his lesson. Rushing had gotten him shot 7 times. This time he'd move carefully. Captain Tony Rizzo worked directly under Marco. He ran collections in the financial district, managing accounts from businesses that paid for protection. Tony was loyal to whoever held power. He didn't care about honor or rules, just money and survival. Vittorio knew men like Tony. They were useful but dangerous. They'd betray anyone if the situation changed. That made Tony perfect for what came next. Antonio discovered that Tony was talking to federal agents. Just casual conversations at first, nothing serious. But Tony was nervous. Marco's operation was messier than Vittorio's had been. More violence meant more police attention. Tony wanted an insurance policy in case everything collapsed. Vittorio arranged for that information to leak. Not directly to Marco, that would be too obvious. Instead, he made sure Tony's second-in-command overheard a conversation at a bar. Details about Tony meeting with federal agents. Descriptions of Tony answering questions about territorial operations. The second-in-command went straight to Sal Russo with the information. Sal didn't waste time investigating. He didn't ask questions. He just acted. 2 days later, Tony Rizzo was found dead in his car, shot 3 times in the head. Marco was furious. Not because Tony died, but because Sal had executed a captain without permission. Their partnership cracked a little wider. And throughout the organization, soldiers whispered about betrayal, about informants, about how no one could be trusted anymore. Fear was spreading. Vittorio had planted the first seed. Strange things started happening. Small things at first. But in an organization where symbols mattered, these details were terrifying. A captain found a silver coin on his desk. The coin had a wolf etched on one side. Vittorio's personal symbol. His calling card for 20 years. The captain showed it to Marco, who dismissed it as a sick joke. But the captain didn't sleep well that night. 3 days later, another coin appeared at a crime scene where 2 of Sal's enforcers had roughed up a shop owner. The shop owner mentioned it to neighbors. And neighbors talked. More coins appeared. Always in places connected to Marco's operations. Always after something went wrong. Botched collection. Failed negotiation. Territory dispute. The Silver Wolf watched everything. Soldiers began talking. Old-timers remembered Vittorio's coin. Remembered how he'd leave it as warning or promise. Younger members heard stories about the boss who'd supposedly died but whose ghost seemed to haunt every mistake the new leadership made. Marco executed 2 soldiers for spreading superstitious nonsense. But that just made others more careful. The fear went underground, spreading through whispered conversations. Someone was watching. Someone remembered. Vittorio didn't need to show his face to destroy their organization. He just needed to make them paranoid. And paranoid men make terrible decisions. He had Antonio spread carefully crafted lies. Rumors that Marco was keeping a larger share of profits than agreed. Whispers that Sal was planning to eliminate Luca and take the dock operations. Stories that Luca was meeting with rival families to make separate deals. None of it was true. But truth didn't matter when greed and fear were in play. Marco started questioning Sal's loyalty during meetings. Sal responded by placing his own soldiers in Marco's territories to ensure security. Luca, feeling threatened by both men, began secretly moving money into offshore accounts where neither partner could touch it. A meeting between the 3 leaders ended with shouting, then threats, then Sal's hand moving toward his gun before Antonio stepped between them. The partnership was fracturing. And Vittorio was barely doing anything. He was just showing them their own nature. More violence followed. A warehouse belonging to Luca burned down. Everyone assumed Sal's people did it. 2 of Sal's collectors disappeared. Marco's crew was blamed. Marco's favorite restaurant got shot up. Luca denied responsibility, but no one believed him. The families watched nervously. This was what happened when bosses fought each other instead of maintaining order. This was chaos. And in chaos, loyalty became impossible to maintain. Vittorio watched from the shadows, satisfied. They were doing exactly what he'd predicted. Luca de Luca couldn't sleep anymore. Every night the same nightmare. He stood in that warehouse on Pier 47, holding the gun, watching his cousin collapse bleeding. 7 bullets. Luca had fired 3 of them. The guilt started small. Just occasional thoughts about family, betrayal, the look in Vittorio's eyes. But those thoughts grew louder. Vittorio's face appeared every time Luca closed his eyes. Luca started drinking heavily. Whiskey before noon, vodka before meetings, anything to quiet the ghosts. His dock operations started slipping. Shipments delayed. Money missing. His soldiers noticed their boss falling apart. One night, drunk and alone in his office, Luca saw the silver coin on his desk. He hadn't left it there. His door had been locked. But there it was, a wolf staring up at him like a judge. "He's dead," Luca whispered. "We killed him. He's dead." But the coin suggested otherwise. Deep down, Luca knew the truth. Vittorio wasn't the type to die easily. And if he'd survived, Luca was living on borrowed time. The nightmares got worse. Luca stopped going home. He slept in his office with a gun under his pillow, jumping at every sound, trusting no one. Sal Russo was different from Luca. He didn't feel guilt. He felt excited. The city was his playground now, and he could do whatever he wanted without Vittorio's soft rules holding him back. So when someone offered Sal an opportunity that seemed too perfect, he grabbed it immediately without questioning the source. A territory in the West Side had opened up. The family controlling it had imploded in a leadership dispute. Valuable territory, gambling, protection, loan operations, worth millions annually. And apparently it was available for the taking. The information came through a middleman Sal had used before, someone reliable. The middleman said a group of independent operators wanted to sell the territory for half its value. They needed money fast and didn't want a war with Sal's organization. Sal met with Marco and Luca to discuss it. Marco was suspicious immediately. "This smells wrong," he said. "Territory doesn't just open up like that." But Sal saw opportunity where Marco saw danger. "You're paranoid," Sal told him. "Sometimes deals are just deals." Luca didn't care either way. He was too busy drinking to focus on expansion. So Sal moved forward alone. He pulled together a team, raised the money, and met with the operators to finalize the deal. The meeting was a setup. Federal agents were waiting. They had recordings of Sal discussing illegal operations, photos of money exchanges, testimony from informants. The arrest was perfect, airtight, designed to put Sal away for life. Sal's lawyer later explained the trap's sophistication. Someone had spent weeks building this, creating fake operators, establishing the middleman's credibility, making everything look legitimate until the moment agents moved in. Sal knew exactly who'd done this. He just couldn't prove it from prison. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Prosecutors presented evidence that destroyed any hope of acquittal. Recordings caught Sal discussing protection rackets, illegal gambling, loan sharking. They had financial records, witness testimony, photographs. Marco didn't visit him in jail, didn't send lawyers, didn't try to help. He abandoned Sal completely, worried that any connection would bring federal attention. Luca sent one message: "You brought this on yourself." Sal sat alone in his cell, understanding how thoroughly he'd been played. Someone had studied him, knew his weaknesses, understood that greed would make him sloppy. Someone had set a trap and watched him walk into it. The jury delivered their verdict in 2 hours. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Sal to 40 years in federal prison. He'd be 70 before he saw freedom again. As guards led him away, Sal noticed something in the courtroom's back row. A man with gray hair and a beard, wearing cheap clothes, watching him with dark, familiar eyes. The man smiled slightly, touched his chest where a heart would be, then disappeared. Sal understood then. Vittorio was alive. And this was only the beginning. 5 months after the betrayal, Vittorio was stronger. His body had healed as much as it ever would. The scars remained, permanent reminders of what had happened on Pier 47. The 7th bullet stayed lodged near his heart, too dangerous to remove, a constant pressure in his chest that told him he was living on borrowed time. But borrowed time was enough. He'd accomplished more as a ghost than he'd managed as a visible boss. Sal was in prison. Marco and Luca were fighting. The organization was fracturing. Fear had replaced confidence. And no one knew who was really pulling the strings. Antonio brought news that made Vittorio smile for the first time in months. 3 more captains had left Marco's organization. They weren't joining rivals. They were just disappearing, taking their money and connections somewhere safe. The empire was bleeding soldiers. "Marco's offering double pay to anyone who stays," Antonio reported. "He knows the ship is sinking." Vittorio looked at himself in a mirror. He barely recognized the reflection. Gone was the clean-cut boss in expensive suits. This man looked weathered, scarred, dangerous in a different way. This man had survived death. This man had patience that came from having nothing left to lose. "It's time," Vittorio said quietly. "Time to remind Luca what family means." Antonio nodded. Luca would be next. Not arrested like Sal, that was too easy. Luca needed to face the cousin he'd betrayed. Needed to look Vittorio in the eyes and remember pulling that trigger. The king was stepping closer. And his mercy had died in that warehouse 5 months ago. Luca de Luca was drunk when Vittorio appeared. He sat alone in his office at the docks, staring at reports he couldn't focus on, jumping at shadows. The door opened quietly. Luca looked up through bleary eyes and saw a figure in the doorway. Gray hair, beard, scars, but those eyes. Luca knew those eyes. "No," Luca whispered. "You're dead. We killed you." "You tried," Vittorio said, stepping into the light. "You failed." Luca stumbled backward, knocking over his chair. His hand went to the desk drawer where he kept his gun, but Vittorio moved faster. He grabbed Luca's wrist and twisted until bone cracked. "Cousin," Vittorio said quietly. "Family. Blood. You remember what those words meant." Luca collapsed to his knees, crying. Not from pain, though his broken wrist hurt, but from guilt, from fear, from seeing the ghost he'd created. "I'm sorry," Luca sobbed. "Marco promised me power. He said you'd gone soft. I was weak. I was stupid." "3 bullets," Vittorio interrupted. "You fired 3 bullets into my chest. You watched me bleed. You walked away. Sorry doesn't cover that." "Then kill me," Luca begged. "Please." Vittorio stared at his cousin. Death would be mercy. Luca didn't deserve mercy. "I'm not going to kill you," Vittorio said. "Death is too easy." He pulled Luca to his feet and made him look into his eyes. "You wanted power. Wanted to be important. Let me show you what that costs." Over the next hour, Vittorio systematically destroyed everything Luca had. He had Antonio seize control of the dock operations. He had loyal contacts freeze Luca's bank accounts. He made phone calls to every family in the city, explaining that Luca de Luca was no longer protected, no longer connected, no longer anyone worth respecting. "You're exiled," Vittorio told him. "Not dead, that would be too kind. You'll live the rest of your life knowing you betrayed family for nothing. Knowing you destroyed your own future. Every day you'll wake up with nothing, and you'll remember this was your choice." He took Luca's identification, his credit cards, his phone, his keys. Everything that proved he existed in their world. "You're nobody now," Vittorio said. "Just like you made me nobody when you put those bullets in my chest." Luca was still crying when Antonio escorted him out of the office. They drove him to the edge of the city and left him on a dark street with nothing but the clothes on his back. No money, no connections, no future. Vittorio watched from a distance as Luca stumbled away into the night. Exile was worse than death for a man like Luca. Every day would be torture. Every moment would remind him of what he'd lost. That was real revenge. Marco Bellini felt the walls closing in. First Sal arrested. Then Luca disappeared. Half of Marco's captains had deserted. Soldiers were refusing orders. Money was vanishing from accounts. The other families stopped returning Marco's calls. Political connections dried up overnight. Even the cops he'd been bribing started avoiding him. He called a meeting with his remaining lieutenants. Only 4 showed up. 4 out of 20. The rest had made excuses or disappeared. "Someone's dismantling us piece by piece," Marco told them. But he already knew who. Deep down Marco understood. The silver coins. The rumors. The systematic attacks. This had Vittorio's fingerprints all over it. Impossible but true. Marco tried to hire assassins. They refused the job. He tried to negotiate with rival families. They laughed. He tried to move his money to safety, only to discover someone had already emptied most accounts. His penthouse felt like a prison. He stopped leaving, too paranoid. Food tasters checked every meal. Bodyguards searched every room. But Marco knew the truth. When Vittorio decided to come for him, no amount of security would matter. The abduction happened on a quiet Tuesday night. Marco was sleeping in his fortified penthouse, protected by 5 bodyguards, behind locked doors and security systems that cost $500,000. None of it mattered. When Marco woke up, he was sitting in a chair in an empty warehouse. No guards, no weapons, no phone. Just him and the dark and the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. "Hello, Marco," Vittorio said. Marco's blood turned cold. He tried to turn around, but his hands were zip-tied to the chair. "How did you, the security, my men?" "Your men work for me now," Vittorio said, walking into view. "Have for weeks. I offered them something you couldn't, survival." Marco stared at the ghost in front of him. Vittorio looked different, scarred and harder, but unmistakably alive. "You're supposed to be dead. You tried very hard to make that true," Vittorio said calmly. 7 bullets. You thought that would be enough. "Vittorio, listen," Marco said quickly, his mind racing for words that might save his life. "We can fix this. I'll give you everything back. Territory, money, control. I made mistakes. I was ambitious. But we can work together again. Do you remember what you told me after the second bullet?" Vittorio interrupted. "You said, 'We're done following your rules.' That's what this was really about, wasn't it? Not power. Not money. You just hated having rules." Marco fell silent. "Those rules kept order," Vittorio continued. "Protected civilians. Maintained respect between families. You tore them down in weeks. You made our world chaos." "You're going to kill me," Marco said, resigned. "Make it quick." Vittorio shook his head slowly. "I told you, death is too easy. The worst punishment isn't death. It's watching everything you built collapse while you're powerless to stop it." He walked behind Marco's chair and cut the zip ties. Marco rubbed his wrists, confused. "What are you doing?" "You're free to go," Vittorio said. "Walk out that door. Leave the city. Start over." Marco stood slowly, not trusting this. "Just like that." "Just like that," Vittorio confirmed. "But understand something first. Every family knows what you did. Every organization knows you betrayed your boss and lost to a dead man. Your name is poison now. No one will work with you. No one will trust you. You'll spend your life looking over your shoulder, waiting for someone to collect on the debts you created." Marco felt something worse than fear. He felt insignificant. Vittorio wasn't killing him because he wasn't worth killing. "Go," Vittorio said. "Disappear. Live with what you did. Every morning you'll wake up remembering you tried to be powerful and ended up nothing." Marco stumbled toward the warehouse door. As he stepped outside, he realized he had nowhere to go. No money, no power, no future. Just shame and fear. Word spread fast. Vittorio Caruso was alive. He'd survived 7 bullets and returned from the dead. He'd systematically destroyed the men who'd betrayed him without firing a single shot. Marco exiled, Sal imprisoned, Luca broken. The families called a meeting. All 7 major organizations sent representatives to a neutral location. They needed to understand what came next, whether Vittorio's return meant war or stability. Vittorio walked into that meeting looking like the ghost of their worst nightmares. Scars visible, gray hair, expensive suit that didn't quite hide his damaged body. But his eyes, those eyes carried authority that made everyone fall silent. "I didn't come back for war," Vittorio said simply. "I came back for order." He laid out new terms. The territories would return to their previous arrangements. The rules would be restored. No civilian casualties, no drugs near schools, disputes settled through negotiation. Families that wanted stability would have it. Families that wanted chaos could deal with him personally. Marco thought my rules made us weak, Vittorio continued. He was wrong. Rules make us professional. They separate us from street thugs. They let us operate in peace. The families agreed unanimously. They'd seen what happened without Vittorio's leadership. 5 months of chaos was enough. They wanted the old order back. They wanted someone who understood that power without wisdom was just violence. Vittorio reclaimed his position that night. Not through force, through respect. Through proving that survival and patience were stronger than ambition and betrayal. Rebuilding took time. Vittorio spent 3 months restructuring his organization. He promoted loyal soldiers who'd stayed quiet during his absence. He brought back old captains who'd left during Marco's reign. He re-established connections with politicians, police, and business owners. The rules returned. Protection fees dropped to reasonable levels. Violence decreased. Territories stabilized. Shop owners who'd lived in fear found peace again. The city remembered what order felt like. But Vittorio wasn't the same boss. This version was harder, more careful. He trusted fewer people. He maintained distance. The 7th bullet still pressed against his heart, a constant reminder that mercy could kill you. Antonio became his new consigliere. The only man who'd stayed loyal when loyalty meant choosing a ghost over the living. Dr. Chen received a permanent salary for saving Vittorio's life. The legend of Vittorio's survival spread beyond the city. Other organizations heard the story. How a man survived 7 bullets, destroyed his betrayers without violence, and reclaimed his empire through patience instead of war. Vittorio's scars became his badge of honor. Proof that he'd survived what should have killed him. Proof that some men couldn't be erased so easily. 6 months after his return, Vittorio stood on the balcony of his penthouse watching the sun rise over his city. The same city that had tried to forget him. The same empire that had been stolen and reclaimed. His chest ached where the 7th bullet remained lodged. Doctors said removing it was too risky. The surgery might kill him. So Vittorio lived with that bullet, a permanent piece of his betrayal carried inside his own body. Sometimes he thought about Marco, Sal, and Luca. 3 men who'd wanted power so badly they'd betrayed family and honor to get it. Sal was in prison. His life measured in decades behind bars. Luca was somewhere out there living as a ghost, stripped of everything that made him matter. Marco had disappeared completely, probably using a fake name in a new city where no one knew his face. They'd tried to kill Vittorio Caruso. They'd shot him 7 times and left him bleeding on a warehouse floor. They'd stolen his empire and erased his name. They'd thought they'd won. But surviving was their biggest mistake. Because Vittorio came back stronger, smarter, more patient than they'd ever imagined. He'd proven that real power wasn't about violence. It was about understanding people's weaknesses and using those weaknesses against them. It was about strategy and patience and knowing that sometimes the best revenge wasn't death. It was living to see your enemies destroy themselves. The sun climbed higher. The city below woke up to another day of order. And Vittorio Caruso, the king who'd returned from the grave, smiled slightly. His enemies had taught him an important lesson. There are worse things than death. And the underworld never forgets the man who came back from his own funeral.